Good evening. Oh, that was very nice. Thank you. Welcome to the Hilltop. Welcome to SMU, and to an evening sure to educate and enlighten. My name is Jeffrey Engel, and I have the honor of directing the Center for Presidential History here at SMU, which is one of your principal hosts for the evening. This also means I have the honor of introducing your other hosts for the evening, the John C. Danforth Center on Religion and Politics, based, of course, at Washington University in St. Louis. And let me say what a wonderful pleasure it is to meet so many people from Washington University in St. Louis. It's nice to make new Dallas friends. On behalf of both those centers and on both those universities, then, welcome indeed. We have a tremendous evening in store for you tonight, the capstone to a full day of discussion on American religion and American politics. Now, this is a day, of course, in which we did what your mother always told you not to do, which was to openly discuss these two third-rail issues of American society. To not talk about religion's role in politics would, to be, in my mind, a great disservice in this profoundly religious nation. It's a nation in which an impressive 84% of respondents claim some religious affiliation. 84%. Now, to give you some means of reference, no major European nation tops more than 50% answering the same question. So religion matters in America, which I think is a statement that's hard to dispute. And the timing of this conference is, of course, no accident. Indeed, when planning a conference for less than 48 hours after Election Day, I can't tell you how many times I thought to myself, we couldn't possibly have timed this better. Why? Because undoubtedly there were two predominant reactions to Tuesday's results. One side exclaimed, "Thank God." The other, "Oh my God." Now, I should note there's actually a third possibility here. For those who wish a pox on both political houses, which of course is a segment of the population that seems to be growing over time, that's a group I think that merely shakes its collective head when surveying the broad electoral landscape, concluding, "May God have mercy on our souls." Now tonight, as a capstone to that day-long discussion, we are gathered, of course, to hear the words and the wisdom of a man experienced in both camps, both the political and the religious. But first, however, let me offer a few words of thanks. First, thanks to our friends at the Danforth Center, who have been wonderful to work with throughout the many months of planning for this event. We hope this is but the first of many collaborations to come. In particular, I'd like to single out my colleague and friend Darren Docek, who, along with Matthew Sutton of Washington State University, performed yeoman's work in developing the intellectual work behind this program, turning it from an idea into a program, ultimately into a conference, and then finally, I'm happy to report, into a book, which will be published in the years to come by Oxford University Press. Now, this is the third major conference here at the Center for Presidential History, now in our third year. It will also, therefore, prove, I'm proud to say, the third volume from a conference published by a major university press. And nothing, absolutely nothing, makes me prouder than to see work which was first presented on our campus published and ultimately put into the hands of teachers and students throughout the country and throughout the world. So my thanks indeed to Darren and Matt for bringing this volume to life. Thanks too, of course, to the ongoing support that we receive here at the Center from the Office of the Provost, Paul Ludden. So too to my colleagues in the Clements Department of History, and especially to the staff of our own Center for Presidential History, Ronna Spitz and Brian Franklin in particular. Indeed, thanks in large measure to Brian's leadership, our center has only this last week released to the public our first comprehensive oral history of a topic from the Bush presidency. In this case, it's a comprehensive look at that historic and pivotal election of 2004. You can find a link to it on our website, but I have to warn you that it's quite intoxicating. When you click on that link, you might never actually get off that website. There's just so much more information there than you can possibly imagine. Indeed, when you're on our website, I encourage you to sign up for our email list, which will give you a list of invitations for future events, including one which I'm very, very pleased to announce. In fact, if you are on the list, you will be getting this invitation tomorrow. So therefore, I encourage you, if you're not on the list, you have a task for homework tonight. And that is that on November 18th at 4 p.m., we are going to be hosting President George W. Bush in a discussion of his new book, which is, of course, a biography of his father. So get on the list, and you can come to that one. One more word of thanks before we turn things over. Thank you indeed to Senator Danforth for taking time out of your schedule to join us tonight in Dallas, especially as we celebrate our partnership with the center that so proudly bears your name. So let me tell you a little bit about how we're going to do things tonight, in particular the format. We're offering essentially a trifecta of sorts. First, we will hear from our featured speaker. Then we'll partake of a little bit of back and forth moderated discussion. And then finally, of course, we'll open things up to your questions and thoughts. Now, to kick things off, I'm going to turn the microphone over to my good friend and colleague, Professor Docek. Now, Darren is, of course, no stranger to the SMU community, having served as a senior fellow in the Clements Center for Southwest Studies. He's an award-winning scholar whose awards and accomplishments are literally too many to mention, or we would use up all of our time tonight, save to say that his is a leading voice in the discussion of American contemporary religion. But let me highlight just two of his works. He is the author of From Bible Belt to Sun Belt, Plain Folk Religion, Grassroots Politics and the Rise of Evangelical Conservatism, and co-editor of the volume Sun Belt Rising, The Politics of Space, Place, and Region. And he is currently in the final stages of a manuscript which I know will be particularly enticing and appealing to those of us here in Texas. It's a study of the way that God and black gold, religion and oil, have intermingled in modern American society. It is to Darren, therefore, that goes the honor of introducing our featured speaker, and thus it's with great pleasure that I turn the mic over to him. Ladies and gentlemen, Professor Docek.
Thank you, Professor Engel, for that generous introduction. Thanks to SMU, the Center for Presidential History, Rana, Brian, and all of the good people here at SMU for being such amazing hosts. You've done an exceptional job of organizing, managing the conference that took place here in this room this morning and afternoon, and then helping, of course, coordinate this wonderful event. It's a privilege to introduce our main speaker for the evening. Before turning the podium over to him, I would like to say just a brief word about his illustrious career in law, politics, and philanthropy. A native of St. Louis, a proud Cardinals fan, St. Louis Blues fan too, I hope, Senator Danforth served 26 years in public office representing his home state. Before entering public service, he was drawn to both religion and law. He graduated with honors from Princeton University and received a divinity degree from Yale Divinity School and a Bachelor of Laws degree from Yale Law School. After practicing law in New York and St. Louis, Danforth began his political career in 1968 when he was elected Attorney General of Missouri, his first race for public office, at the age of 32, I believe. He was reelected to that post in 1972. Missouri voters elected him to the U.S. Senate in 1976, and he was reelected in 1982 and 1988. During his 18 years in the U.S. Senate, Senator Danforth served in a number of leadership roles, including on the Finance Committee, the Commerce, Science, and Transportation Committee, the Select Committee on Intelligence, and others. Senator Danforth's legislative initiatives included the Research and Development Tax Credit and the Low-Income Housing Tax Credit. As chairman of ranking Republican on the Subcommittee on International Trade, he was involved in all trade legislation enacted by Congress, including the adoption of NAFTA in 1994. In September 1999, Danforth was appointed special counsel by Attorney General Janet Reno to investigate the federal raid on the Branch Davidian compound in Waco, Texas. The investigation entailed interviewing over 1,000 witnesses and examining over 2.3 million pages of documents, along with thousands of pounds of physical evidence. The investigation was completed in just over a year, where it was concluded that government agents were not responsible for the devastation in Waco. In 2004, Danforth represented the United States as U.S. Ambassador to the United Nations, where he focused on ending the North-South Civil War in Sudan, a 20-year conflict that killed 2 million people and displaced 5 million others. A peace agreement between the two sides was ultimately signed in Nairobi, Kenya on January 9, 2005. Prior to his UN appointment, President Bush named Senator Danforth Special Envoy for Peace in Sudan in 2001. Now, The philanthropy. In 2009, the Danforth Foundation, under the leadership of Senator Danforth, endowed the Center on Religion and Politics at Washington University in St. Louis, that now bears his name. As a nonpartisan, non-sectarian, and interdisciplinary research enterprise, the Danforth Center engages the complicated entanglement of religion and politics in America, past and present, through research, instruction, and programming designed to shed light rather than heat on the diversive and divisive issues of our day and throughout the nation's history. Since his distinguished career in public service, Senator Danforth has served as a retired partner at Bryan Cave, a law firm in St. Louis. He is also an ordained Episcopal priest and has, in that capacity, officiated at the funerals of Washington Post executive Katharine Graham, U.S. Senator Harry Byrd Jr., and Ronald Reagan. And he is also an author. One of his books was published in 2006 by Viking, titled Faith and Politics, How the Moral Values Debate Divides America and How to Move Forward Together. And he is currently working on another book about the relationship of religion and politics, which will be published in 2015. So our discussion with him tonight, titled Mending Broken Politics, will invite him to shed light on some of his latest thoughts about this very subject, certainly in the context of our current moment. As you can tell from his remarkable life and career, he is perfectly positioned to do so with the authority, grace, and civility he has continually strived for in his many vocations. Please welcome Senator Danforth.
Thanks a lot. If you really didn't have to name the center after me, I would have come anyhow. I'm happy to be here at SMU. I've never been on the campus of SMU before. I've heard a lot about this place. Great academics, beautiful campus, quirky public address system. But thank you very much, and thank you all for being here tonight. I went to Yale Divinity School, and it didn't take me too long before I realized that was not, the parish ministry was really not for me, nor was the teaching of religion. So I shifted to law school, but I can remember a discussion I had with the then dean of Yale Divinity School, a man named Liston Pope, and I talked to him about finishing my work at the Divinity School while going to law school, and he said, well, that's very interesting, being both a lawyer and a minister. It's something like being a striptease saint. And I didn't talk to him about my possibly going into politics, so I didn't have the advantage of hearing his metaphor and describing what that combination would be. In the middle of the last decade, I wrote some things, some op-eds, and then eventually a book expressing my concern about what I saw then as a very divisive relationship between religion and politics, and how politicians were using religion to their advantage in a very divisive way, focusing on a number of wedge issues which I thought were not helpful. And after that writing effort, Rush Limbaugh devoted about a half an hour of one of his radio programs to me. And has anyone here ever had Rush Limbaugh devote a half an hour to you? You haven't lived. But he said Danforth really wants religious people to stay out of politics. And when I heard that, I thought, no, that's not right. I don't want that. In fact, what I want is the opposite. I want religious people to be involved in politics, but not in a divisive way, not in a way that splits the country up. And So I've been thinking since then about, well, what do I believe about religion and politics, and particularly what positive? I mean, we all talk about the separation of church and state and the importance of the separation of church and state. But is there something constructive that religious people, faithful people, bring to politics, particularly if they believe that politics today is broken, if they think something has gone wrong with it, it's just not functioning very well? Is there anything constructive that religious people have to bring to politics? And that is the subject of what I'm working on right now. I'd like to open up the discussion tonight with 3 vignettes, and just little stories, one of which one you've heard before, 2 you haven't. And I think that they're instructive vignettes. So here they are. The first is a story of my first day on the Senate Finance Committee. Now, the Senate Finance Committee is the best committee to be on in the U.S. Senate. It has to do with all taxes. Everything dealing with taxes is in the Finance Committee. International trade, Medicare, Social Security, these are all Finance Committee issues. And it's a terrific committee. And it was chaired, when I first went to the Senate, by Russell Long, who was just one of the most intriguing people who just really knew politics very, very well. And Russell Long was a Democrat, and when I went to the Senate, there were only 38 Republicans who were in the Senate when I first got there. So 38 is nothing, you know? I mean, they say, well, they're going to be, 47 or whatever Democrats. Oh, they've really lost. Try being 38, you know? I mean, it was just nothing. My first day on the Finance Committee, I got to the committee room, and I had never met Russell Long before. And he had been there maybe 30 some odd years in the U.S. Senate, and one of the most powerful people as the chairman of the Finance Committee. And the work of the committee that first day that I was there was to write a letter to the Budget Committee outlining what the Finance Committee intended to do that year. So there was a little pause in the proceedings after I was maybe an hour. So I raised my hand and I said, Mr. Chairman, I have an idea. And Russell Long looked down the length of the table at this person he'd never seen before, but he knew he was sitting on the minority side of the Senate. And he said, well, what's the senator's idea? And I said, being a Republican, I think we should have a tax cut. And he said, oh, how much of a tax cut? Well, I hadn't thought about that. And so I said the first thing that came to my mind, $5 billion. Now back then, $5 billion was real money. I said, $5 billion. And he said, all right, is there any objection? And nobody said anything. And he said, all right, that's agreed to. And I thought, wow, this is going to be great. And I rushed back to my office and cranked out a press release telling my constituents that on my first day at work, I'd gotten them a $5 billion tax cut. Well, of course, I'd done nothing of the kind. We weren't legislating, we were writing a letter. But here's the question. Why did Russell Long do that? And the reason he did it was to make me look good. He was doing me a favor to somebody he'd never seen before. He was making me look good. He knew that I would look good to my constituents. He was a Democrat, I was a Republican, and that's why he did it. Fast forward 8 years, Republicans were in control of the Senate, had the majority, and I became the chairman of the Commerce Committee. And so I went by to visit Russell Long to ask him his advice on how to be a good committee chairman. And he gave me 2 pieces of advice. He said, first of all, never, never hold a grudge, because your opponent today you'll need as your ally tomorrow. And he said, secondly, give everybody on your committee a piece of the legislation. Give them something in that legislation that they own so that they are for it. I think it's a lesson for today. And I think it's a lesson for members of Congress, and I think it's a lesson for President Obama. What would be wrong if each party would say, I really want to make the other side look good? And that's the way legislation works. It's not a matter of rolling somebody or humiliating somebody or crushing the opposition. The way legislation works is you get enough people to say, this is mine, that they want to pass it. And so creating that ownership and that participation is a very, very important part of the legislative process. And I think it's largely lost today. I think now it's just a zero-sum game. And I think that's the reason we're not getting anywhere. Maybe we will now, but we certainly haven't for some period of time. Vignette number 2. And Bob Dole was the Republican leader in the Senate. The leader's office in the Senate consists of essentially 3 rooms. There's some smaller rooms, but there are 2 large rooms. And they sandwich a much smaller room. And the much smaller room has a small window, and it has a very large table and chairs around the table. And Dole's idea for legislating was to get everybody who had anything to do with the legislation, any conceivable interest, and get them to go back to his office, which was this little room. And so you'd go back there if you were interested in whatever the bill was, and you'd just be stuffed in there in this room around this table, and there'd be staffers crammed around the perimeter of the room. And I suppose there was ventilation, but maybe not. And we'd be there for hours, and it became unbearable. And to say that this is an incentive to get something done, yes. And I can remember staggering out of that room and going on just to get some air, and going on the floor of the Senate and then in the Republican cloakroom, and there would be Dole. He wasn't in the room. He was in an overstuffed leather chair, and he always asked the same thing. Got it worked out yet? Didn't matter what the it was. His idea of legislating was to work things out. And that's what it takes. It takes a lot of people talking, sometimes for a long period of time. I was involved in what was called the Civil Rights Act of 1991. It's very complicated. It was 2 years of negotiation. It was just endless. And about this word and that word, and how do you phrase it? What do you do? What's in, what's out? That is the legislative process. It's negotiation. And here again, I think things have changed, because I think there's no real negotiation now. You know, if I were President Obama, I would never break bread with myself without having members of Congress there with me. I'd bring them in. I'd serve them food. I'd have members of my cabinet there. I would line up meetings after the meeting. They could pass a lot of stuff. Certainly tax legislation, everybody agrees that should be done. But it takes a lot of work and a lot of effort and a lot of talking and communication. So that's vignette 2, Dole in that breathless, awful room. And the third is something that you may remember. This happened in Iowa in 2012. It was a Republican debate. There were 8 Republican presidential hopefuls, and they were on a stage, and Brett Baer was the moderator from CNN. And he asked about a possible budget deal, and he said, would you raise your hand if you would disagree with the idea of a budget deal where there were $1 of tax increases for every $10 of real budget cuts? And all 8 raised their hands. Now, it's a ridiculous position because it says this is not going to be negotiated. Not going to be any negotiation. Right from the get-go, we're going to tell you it's over. Therefore, there's not going to be any budget deal. The biggest problem we have as a country, which is a national debt that's about $18 trillion now, you got to work it out with a deal. And they were saying no. It's very curious to me that the people who take that position, for some bizarre reason, call themselves constitutional conservatives. There's nothing constitutional about this, for 2 reasons. First, the first of the enumerated powers for Congress in Article 1 of the Constitution is the power to lay and collect taxes. If you say, well, we're not going to do that, and then the second reason it's not exactly a constitutional position is that the way the Constitution is written is this convoluted process of checks and balances which is designed to force working things out. So that was vignette 3. One final question for you to think about, and that is, why is it that those 8 candidates thought that they had to raise their hands for really a ridiculous proposition? And the reason that they had to raise their hands was that's what they were hearing from the people who were going to go to the Iowa caucuses. It's what they were hearing. Politicians don't live in a vacuum. They respond to what they hear from the people. And what they were hearing was, if I agree to any tax increase, even a 10-to-1 deal, my goose is cooked. I've lost. That's because that's what they're hearing. So that is my question for you. What are politicians hearing? Who's speaking to them? Is it just the so-called base of each party? Because if it is, then what they're hearing is only from the edges of American politics, not from the center. Who are they hearing from? And so when Rush Limbaugh says, I don't want religious people to be involved in politics, I want them, and as he said, to shut up. Oh, no, I don't. I want religious people to be more outspoken now than they have been by a long shot. So those are my comments. I hope I haven't taken too long. It's supposed to be 10 minutes. Seemed endless, probably, but thank you.
I'm sure we're all anxious for more vignettes, so we'll do our best to cover some ground here.
I think think we're missing more microphones. If you have any more, please bring them up. Okay, Senator, I'm going to hand this to you. Actually, I'm going to hand it to Darren to ask the first question. There's certainly a lot you've given us to think about, and certainly a lot that we want to discuss about the state of contemporary affairs in America. So until the other mic gets here, here you go. Is it behind us?
You know what? It's right here. Test. All right. Wonderful. Thank you. Thanks for those introductory words. I want to build on those. The title of our session today is Mending Broken Politics, so it might be helpful, I think, to run backwards on that. Let's start with the politics, move to the broken, and then finish with the mending. I think that's an appropriate way to end. So I'd like to hear more about how you mentioned a few people who inspired you in the political sphere. How in your career did you see religion working in Washington? Were there individuals or politicians who, in your estimation, represented the best that religion had to offer politics?
You know, it's curious because I started thinking specifically on the question of the relationship between the two in response to the emergence of the Christian right, and particularly in response to the Terry Schiavo case, if you can remember what that is. That's what really focused it on me. Now, when I was doing politics, I didn't think of myself as sort of religion's agent in American politics. I mean, I think you bring to whatever you do, politics or anything else, the totality of who you are. And that's what I was. And there were a few issues I was very interested in: world hunger. I think that was prompted specifically by religion. But most of the things I did, no, I didn't think that way. I didn't think, oh, what's God want me to do? You know, it's like the baseball players. Wow, I just hit a double. Thank you, Jesus. But I just didn't think that. And I don't think my constituents did either. Everybody knew what I was. I mean, I didn't hide it. Everybody knew I was ordained to the clergy of the Episcopal Church. Am, haven't been defrocked yet. But nobody asked me, please do something because this is the religious approach. I think that's a recent thing. So I think the general way of going about it, rather than sort of this is God's position on this issue, I think that was what was important. And I think that there are, Darren asked about what kinds of people do I think best reflected that. And when people ask me who was the best senator you served with, well, the answer is Howard Baker, who was the Republican leader, who's from Tennessee. And he just had the ability to work with people. And he also had the smallest ego of anyone that I knew in politics. It's a wonderful thing to have a small ego. So most of us, to the contrary, but I think that was really important about Baker.
So we spent the day, scholars wrestling with the question, what is religion? Secondly, what is politics? Can you say a bit more about how you see religion and politics working together, but also in separate spheres? How do you define the two? What should be the healthy relationship between the two?
Well, Paul Tillich spoke of religion in terms of ultimate concern. And I think that's a very useful term to think about. What is your ultimate concern? And that is religion. And politics cannot become our ultimate concern. Because politics is just politics. It's not religion. And if you turn politics into what's ultimate, and you enshrine as kind of in the place of God your political ideology and become unmovable with that ideology, intransigent with that ideology, then politics, which is the art of compromise, isn't possible. You can't do it if your political principles are enshrined. So there has to be, I think, a degree of humility. Back in 1982, the first time I ran for re-election to the Senate, and I thought I was going to win easily, and then just a couple of weeks before the election, the polls tightened, and I thought, oh my gosh, I'm going to lose. My whole career is going to be ruined. Life isn't going to be worth living anymore. This is all going to be terrible, and this is not lost in my family. And my daughter, Dee Dee, who is then 15 years old, tried to cheer me up, and it was a nice comment from a good St. Louis girl. Well, it's not the World Series. And, and it isn't, and it sure isn't religion. It's just politics. Not to dismiss it as not being important, because it is very important, but it's also important to keep it in its proper place.
I'm curious, as we think about politics being broken and how to fix politics, the vignettes which you offered at the beginning of your remarks were about politics working. When did you first begin to have a sense that politics were on the wrong track? When did we go wrong?
Well, I first noticed it in 1992, which was 2 years before I left the Senate. Before 1992, it really was working things out, and it was on a bipartisan basis. And the people you knew and the people you associated with in a social way, and the people you worked with were as likely to be Democrats as Republicans. I don't know if you probably are all too young to remember him, but I served in the Senate with Lloyd Benson from Texas. Young people, right? You young people, have you heard of him? He was a great friend and a great colleague in the Senate, and I think that if you lined up our voting, I was probably about as close with Lloyd Benson just in how I saw politics as with anybody in the Senate. We were in the Finance Committee together, and we did a lot of work. He was chairman of the Finance Committee for a time. And so he was really good to work things out. But in 1992, what happened was there were a bunch of people who had served in the House of Representatives as Republicans, and at that time the House was very heavily Democratic, and the Republicans in the minority were just treated like dirt. They may as well not have been there. And they came over to the Senate with the attitude of, okay, now we're going to get even. And so everything was politicized, and everything became, okay, let's not associate with the Democrats, and let's do the contrary. Let's devise amendments to offer to legislation and make them vote on it that'll embarrass them. And you'd go to these luncheons on Tuesday afternoon with all the Republican senators, and that would be it. Make them vote on it. You know, there was this great glint in their eyes. So I think that's what happened. In 1992 it changed, and I don't think it's changed back yet. Maybe it will now, but not yet.
In your estimation, we're looking at the brokenness of American politics. Are there other factors that you notice perhaps in 92 or by 92 within the system itself in terms of leadership, social media, or popular media? In what ways did other factors in American society, do you think, contribute to the breaking of that system?
Well, I mean, back then, I don't know, because, I mean, I think that was so political. It was just something that we were able to live and work on a bipartisan basis, work things out on a bipartisan basis, move forward. Not that we agreed on everything. I don't want you to think that it was just all sweetness and light. It isn't. Politics is a contact sport, it was then, but it was okay, you know, here's your position, here's my position, not necessarily splitting a difference, but what do we do? How do we move forward? And I don't know that related to the general sort of condition of society. I think it was more political one-upsmanship than that. But, I mean, in terms of society in general today, I think politics is broken, and I think that social interaction is broken too. And there are people like Robert Putnam's book, Bowling Alone, is about this, how we become atomized rather than part of the whole. So I think that this in politics is like that too. Politics has become atomized with a bunch of sort of individual contractors, as opposed to a sense of collegiality and a sense of the whole.
What might some potential solutions be? And realizing that solutions are difficult to accomplish, what might the first steps be to changing the culture of Washington, changing the culture of bipartisanship, creating a culture of cooperation? What should we as citizens do to help foster this change?
Well, you know, I mean, I raised the question of those 8 presidential hopefuls standing on that stage and all raising their hands because they had heard a single voice. And what they had heard is, don't give an inch. And that's what you hear now. And last night, you know, I mean, we've all been interested in this past congressional election. And so last night I turned on Fox News and I saw Sean Hannity and Ann Coulter. And they basically, their position is, you don't give an inch and stick your thumb in the president's eye. But a lot of people are saying, well, the American people, when they spoke in the election, they were not saying that. They were saying, no, make government work. Get on with it. Fix this thing. But there is a counter message. And the counter message is very loud and very convincing. And the counter message is particularly important winning primary elections because, I mean, there are statistics to prove this. The people who go and vote in primaries or the people who show up at political meetings are the people who are the true believers, left and right. So there's going to be this continuing Ann Coulter-like don't give an inch on the right, and you can see this pushing Hillary Clinton. From the left, we want somebody who's a real populist. We want somebody who's a real purist. And so those are the loudest voices in politics and the ones who determine results. And so then, if that's true, then all right, let's leaven this lump and get into politics people who have a different message. And I think that that's the thing to do. I think just get yourself involved if you agree that this is broken. If you agree that somehow we got to reconstitute the center, well, then you've got to get involved and do something that you might not want to do. You might not. A lot of people who are just normal folk would rather do anything than show up at some political meeting. This is like going to some extreme fighting match in some pen somewhere. This is awful. Real people don't want to do that. Well, you got to want to do it. And I think that that's the answer. It's more engagement by more people with a message that politics isn't perfect. It's sausage, but it's important sausage.
Are you applauding sausage? Okay. We all like sausage. Let me ask you a follow-up on that, because it strikes me that one of the barriers that average citizens are increasingly seeing to entering the political sphere is the high cost. And I don't just mean in terms of time, I mean actually in terms of dollars. And this last election cycle, to be honest, I lost track of how many billions of dollars were being spent, because every time I turned on the television, the number kept getting higher. I think the last I saw was about $3.6 billion, and probably many of you saw higher estimates. Tell us your thoughts on the role of money in politics today, and the role of money as a part of free speech, the role of money as something which perhaps influences individual citizens choosing to get involved.
Well, I mean, I guess my answer to that is kind of a theoretical answer, in that, yes, I think that the system is skewed, and I think that political campaigns are really terrible, and I think that when particularly interlopers get into politics and spend whatever money that they want on this, then I think that is really putting a weight on the scale that's disproportionate to everything else. But when I said my thoughts on it are theoretical, I don't know what can be done about it, short of amending the Constitution, which is extremely hard to do. And so I tend to think in terms of what's possible, not what's impossible, and I just don't see that as a possibility. But I do think that it's possible for people without necessarily a lot of money to change political debate if they wanted to do that. And how would they go about it? Well, they would go about it in a couple of ways. One thing they could do, you could do it, anybody here could do it. You could do it here in this auditorium, or you could do it in a church basement or any place, is why not have a forum on some issue? And invite politicians and invite one or two experts and keep on that issue for a couple of hours and really educate yourself on it, and try to force candidates to spend enough time on one subject where they really have to present to you the alternatives. Let's take, for example, the entitlement programs. Now, Bob Kerrey, who was the senator from Nebraska, and I co-chaired a commission on the entitlements back in 1994, because it was clear that Social Security and Medicare in particular, were not going to be sustainable. What was done practically as a result of that commission? Zero. Or how about Simpson-Bowles? What was done? Zero. There was a piece in Politico recently that people who supported Simpson-Bowles became targets in this past campaign because they had supported specific changes in Social Security to make it sustainable. So in a 30-second commercial, which has become all of what politics is today, it's possible to say, my opponent voted to cut Social Security 23 times. How long does that take? To explain that we've got real problems in our country with the sustainability of these two major systems, not to speak of the national debt. That takes a time to really focus on that. So would it be possible to create forums to address that? Yes, I think it would be. And I think that, you could do it without much money. And I think another thing you could do, because everybody agrees that, I don't know how it was in Texas these past few weeks, but I know in Missouri, particularly in St. Louis, where we got the Illinois side, we got the Illinois campaigns in our media market, and it's just awful. And the way political campaigns are now is, my position on, say, what to do in Syria and so on is this or that. No, what you do now in a campaign says, if you elect my opponent, he may go to prison. I'm running against a crook. What does that do to the ability of the American people to participate in the Republican form of government, namely representative government? Takes it from them. And it turns politics into something that's just repulsive, and we all know it. But why do politicians do it? Because it works. So maybe it works. So what do I think we should do? Here's my program. Think about this one. Why not go to political meetings and confront candidates and say, candidate blokes, I'd like you to tell me how the commercial you ran, and you say you approved this message, how does that square with your values? Tell me how your commercial squares with your values. And if you're a religious person, how does it square with your religion to just savage somebody like that? See what the answer is going to be. Be very interesting.
Just building on that, actually, talk about practical solutions. To what degree should or can individuals, but even institutions of faith, be part of this process of fixing? Where do you see them playing the most vital role in the process?
Well, I think it would be useful if religious institutions would be very clear in saying that politics isn't religion. I think that would be helpful. I think it would be helpful to take the position, that compromise is a good thing in everyday life. That's pretty good. I don't think you should, they say you'd lose your tax exemption if you endorse candidates, maybe. I don't think you should. And I think it's the idea of taking positions on political issues by churches is sort of cheap grace. I had a clergy friend who said he never went to a clergy conference that didn't end with everybody resolving to go home and write their congressman. Well, that's easy. Just tell somebody else what to do. And, you know, I'm an Episcopalian, and at the last General Convention of the Episcopal Church, they passed 41 resolutions dealing with political questions. And they included statehood for the District of Columbia. We were to support that. No military exercises near the DMZ in Korea. We're all supposed to support Obamacare. So all this stuff about political stuff. But there wasn't a single resolution that asked us to do anything as people. No sense of personal responsibility. What's your responsibility to your family, to your spouse, to your children, to honesty in business practices? Oh no, we're not going to talk about that. That's not for the church. The church is supposed to talk about where military exercises are conducted in Korea. And it's just an absurdity. It doesn't have any political effect at all. And as I say, it's cheap grace. It's the sense that our responsibility is to pass the buck, and it can be discharged by letter writing.
Well, I want to make sure that we have plenty of time for our assembled audience to ask questions. So please ponder your question for a moment and raise your hand. And we have a couple of microphones. The odds are at this point they won't work. But we have a couple of microphones which we're going to pass around. And therefore, if you wouldn't mind waiting till the microphone shows up, that'd be wonderful. And then if you could speak into the mic, that'd be great, because it will make sure that we can save the communication forever through the wonder of videotape. So.
Yes, thank you very much for your talk. It was very refreshing and different from what we usually hear. My question, if you were running as a politician today, which party do you think you would be in, or would there not be a party with your kind of views that you've had tonight?
Well, I'm a Republican, you know, and that's what I've been, and that's what I am. And I sort of, the fundamental views of the Republican Party I'm very comfortable with, you know. I mean, limited government and the importance of the private sector and keeping the burden of taxation and regulation light, and strong national defense and free trade and all of that. That's why I'm a Republican. Aside from the fact that when I first got into politics in my state, there weren't many others. So it was like going to the movies. What's the shortest line to get into? That's the one. But no, I'm comfortable with the fundamental Republican view. But I also, as you can imagine, I mean, as I've tried to say, I am for making government work, and I just recognize that that's the way the system is designed. It's designed to have all these different interests. That's the way Madison thought of it. And the alternative is tyranny. That's how Madison saw it. So he had all these different points of view, and the idea is they all should balance against each other and so on. I like that. And I liked it when I was doing it in the Senate. I liked being in the Senate then. I wouldn't like it now. But I liked it because it was give and take, and it was, okay, let's pass a tax bill. See what happens. Then you can either vote for it or against it. But but as far as basic ideology, yeah, I am a traditional Republican. I'm not a movement. I'm not a Tea Party guy, but I'm just an old-time Republican.
Senator Mark Levin, the radio talk show host, is promoting the idea of a state constitutional convention. Along with that, a number of amendments that he's listed in his book, the Liberty Amendments. Do you think the timing is right for a state constitutional convention, and would it be effective?
You talking about U.S. constitutional convention, or he's talking about each state within that state?
A convention of states focusing on the federal constitution.
Federal constitution? I don't think so. I would be very nervous about that. Because, I mean, I really think our Constitution is just great. How do people who call themselves constitutional conservatives come up with an idea like that, by the way? But no, I think that it is ingenious how our Constitution was written. Just ingenious. So I would oppose it.
There was another conference held here today on national security, and yesterday in Dallas Morning News, the person who headed that conference wrote an op-ed about national security, drawing attention to the importance of focusing on Asia as an area of concern. I talked with him afterwards. Joshua Rebner is his name, and he explained that he thought it was his civic duty as an academic expert to communicate with the general public through op-eds of that kind. It's a point of view with which I agree strongly, and I think universities like this should try to encourage faculty to do more of that. But my question here is, if Richard Hofstadter were alive today, I think it would be writing a new edition of his book about anti-intellectualism in America. So my question is, we have all these experts around here. We can encourage them to write op-eds, but is it going to do any good because there seems to be such a bias against hearing what they have to say anyway? The talking heads, spinmeisters, and so forth seem to have a great deal more influence in our country than the people who actually know what they're talking about.
Well, I mean, I'm all for everybody writing and saying what they want to say, and the more the better. I'm just all for that, and I think if academics want to write op-eds or weigh in, fine, and that's interesting, and they may have something to say. And I think, you know, if you were to have the kind of forums that I was talking about earlier on issues, it would be very helpful to have at that forum, just as a resource, somebody who really, really knew the subject. That said, I don't think people should believe that the business of politics is basically something that should be left to the experts. So many times when I was in the Senate, I would go back to my state and people would say, well, you really know what's going on. You just tell us what's going on. And I just don't think there's any reason why anybody can't know what's going on. Just read a good newspaper. You know, when I was in the Senate, as Darren said when he introduced me, I was for a time on the Senate Intelligence Committee. Intelligence Committee in the Senate, you meet in this bubble room, you know, with vault doors, and this is all secret, and you can't take notes out of the room. And it's a violation of the criminal law to say what happened in the Intelligence Committee. I'd wake up in the morning and read the Washington Post for an hour or so, and then I'd go to the Intelligence Committee and I'd be briefed on what I just read. And then I think, can I talk about this, or will I be on the slammer for talking about this? But my point is that informed citizens know, or can know just by making it their business to know, everything you could reasonably want to know on any subject before the government.
Let me ask a follow-up to that, if I could. A follow-up to both the question about foreign policy, but also to your time on the Intelligence Committee. The purpose of our conference today was to discuss religion's role in policy and religion's role in politics. And of course, when we think of religion, we think of analogous terms of values and morality. We've been at war now for 14 odd years. And during that time, the United States has had to make some extraordinarily difficult decisions that I think the leaders who had to make them, even they would recognize that these were morally ambiguous and difficult decisions. How can we ensure that we are conducting not only politics in line with our values, but a foreign policy that's in line with our values, especially in an increasingly dangerous world?
I don't know, you kind of muddle through, don't you? I don't know. It's very, very difficult. It's the old question of realism versus idealism in foreign policy. And I'm not sure that they are totally mutually exclusive. But I think that if our foreign policy is guided strictly by idealism, you can get into some big trouble that way. And you view America then as the sort of the arbiter of what other countries should be doing, and I just don't think it works. I know, when look, I worked for George W. Bush at the UN and for the Sudan thing, and I really do admire him a lot. But in his second inaugural speech, when he talked about, spreading freedom and so on, wow, it would be great if we could spread freedom. I don't think that's a policy, because I think that it just gets into a kind of an interventionism which leads to very, very bad situation. So I'm not sure how to really answer that question. You have your values as a country, you're proud of those values, you speak about those values, but is that really the basis of conducting foreign policy, real politic? I don't think so. That's just my view.
Tim, could you get somebody from that side of the room? It would be great.
Senator, the intersection of politics and religion seems to be abundantly apparent in the debate concerning the institution of marriage. In your opinion, do you think our system is working, in particular where the will of the people in states vote that a marriage is between a man and a woman, and our judiciary has different thoughts?
I think as a popular issue, this is evolving with just amazing speed. And what was unimaginable 10 years ago now is generally accepted. And I think that the people who the people who are really opposed to same-sex marriage, strongly opposed to same-sex marriage, tend to be older people, my age, who never conceived of the idea until they were about in their 60s. They never heard of it. Doesn't mean that they're mean or homophobic. It just means that this is to them as something that was not within their kin. So I think that as a popular issue, it's something that is evolving. Now, the Supreme Court has in part decided this issue. Lower courts have decided this issue to a greater extent. The Supreme Court will decide it in totality in the next year or so, maybe more than that. So I think that it's now over. I think that issue is over. I think it's just behind us. And therefore, I think that to keep it going as a political issue is a mistake. And I think it's a mistake for two reasons. I think it's a mistake because it's divisive. And I think it's a mistake because constantly fighting old battles is, I don't think, a good thing for the country. So I think that issue is behind us, it's over, and that's that.
Senator, I have been impressed with the newscasts, as you have been, about politicians setting up a home in the Washington, D.C. area after they've been in politics for a certain period of time and losing touch with the people for whom they're supposed to be serving. Don't you think that term limits with a limit on their being able to lobby their former colleagues for at least 10 years would solve a lot of those problems?
Are you asking about people once they've left, let's say, the Senate, staying in Washington? Or are you talking about people who are in the Senate whose family is living in Washington with them?
Well, I'm talking about one in particular that they couldn't establish that she had an address at her home, in her home state.
While they're in
They
Washington?
are serving in the Senate. They've been there long enough that they've lost touch with their constituency.
Yeah. Okay. First of all, I doubt that they've lost touch with their constituents. Maybe they have. They're not going to win the next election if they have. And people say that about Bob Bennett, that he almost lost his election because allegedly he didn't live there, and it becomes a political issue. So I think that politicians who want to have some staying power have to keep touch, and in fact they do, and they travel a lot in their state. But I think that the basic problem is more on the other side of that, and that is I think there's a lot to be said about personal interaction among members of Congress and people in government, knowing each other, knowing their families. And when we were in Washington, my wife was in Washington, my children were in Washington, and it was important. So when I went back to the state, I never thought of myself as a Washingtonian. I can tell I was never a Redskins fan, but I've always thought, since I could think, I've always thought of myself as a Missourian. But I think that it's important for there to be social action among members of Congress. And I think it's important for their families to be encouraged to live in Washington. I think that it's important for them to be there enough of the week and enough of the year so that they can be in each other's homes. Right now, the work week is basically Tuesday through Thursday, maybe 4 weeks out of 5. Somebody told me that 70 members of the House of Representatives sleep in their offices. That's not a real life. And so I think that there should be real people with real lives and real families who know each other as human beings and not simply as just sort of political things that operate without any regard to their total humanity.
I think we have time for one more question. I think there's somebody on this side.
I'm a 14-year-old girl, but how should I be?
And me to Washington. And we went to the Senate gallery. And I can remember sitting in the Senate gallery and saying to myself, I want to do that someday. And I can remember also what my dad said as we were leaving. He said, what a bunch of windbags. But that was before I'd expressed to anybody, hey, I'd like to do that. And then after that, they were very encouraging, that's what you want to do, great. But I did everything I could do to get out of school for a day. I'd go to model UNs, I'd go to mock political conventions, I'd go anytime they'd let me out to go and hear a speaker, and then we'd have like school assemblies and debates. I always did that at school. And then when I got to be, just old enough to drive, I volunteered for political campaigns. And I volunteered for campaigns for people who didn't have a chance. Because if they're big deals or if they have a chance, they've got a lot of people, so you're looking envelopes. But if you really want to do something where they give you a responsibility, go to a campaign where they don't have a chance. And they're so happy to see somebody who will do something, they'll put you to real work. So I think, try to get out of school for good stuff. And then find some loser and sign on for his campaign.
Well, it's nice that we're applauding losers. Well, this has been fascinating, and most of the day, as I mentioned, was spent discussing not only religion, but values. And one of the values that I hold dear is keeping a promise. And the promise that we made to the senator was that we would make sure he got to his plane on time. So, 2 requests from you. The first is, in a moment we're going to end, and I'll ask if you wouldn't mind, instead of swarming the senator with your congratulations, just give him your congratulations by applause so he can please make it out to the door on time. With that, then, the last thing, which is to offer those congratulations. So, Senator, thank you, sir.
Thank you.